as we ought to know, but we know that when we see him, we will be like him. Paul says that at this point, we see as though through a glass dimly. Then we will know, but we do not yet know as we ought to know. So clearly, all of theology is not wrapped up in the epistles. You cannot expect to know everything simply by reading any one epistle, or even all the epistles. Then number 2, the epistles were written to deal with issues in the church and to answer questions. This follows the line of reasoning that we've just been discussing. The epistles are not intended to teach you everything. Instead, they're written for specific issues. And as we've mentioned, a lot of times they're to correct some kind of behavior or a doctrinal error. Look with me at Galatians chapter 1. Turn to verses 6 and 7. I'll read it to you. I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. We see here then that Paul is writing the epistle to the Galatians to help fix their doctrine about what the gospel is. Some Judaizers have infiltrated the ranks of the Galatian church and have told them that they need to be circumcised. And Paul deals time and time again throughout the chapters with its salvation by faith through grace has nothing to do with circumcision. He goes with some very strong language against circumcision because he needs to be very clear about what the gospel is and what it isn't. We see within the Galatians a confrontation he has with Peter in order to ensure that the gospel remains pure. So the epistle to the Galatians was written very specifically to discuss what pure gospel is based on faith and not based on circumcision. Then, as we said, they're intended to deal with issues. Now, a lot of times we only know what the epistle has said and not what the church's issues were that were communicated to the apostle. In 1 Corinthians, we don't know everything the Corinthians had written to Paul, and yet we know some of it because Paul responds based on the things that they had written about. He says in 1 Corinthians 7, now about your questions about marriage. And then in 7:25, now about your questions about virgins. Or about when you ask me food sacrificed to idols. Or how about when you ask me about spiritual gifts? I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, about spiritual gifts. Then in chapter 16, he says now about God's collection, or the collection for God's people. And then in 16:12, he says now about Apollos, as they had discussed. So we see very clearly that 1 Corinthians is an occasional letter. They had questions for Paul, and Paul answered them. Don't expect in 1 Corinthians then to know everything Paul thought about Christianity. Even in a book as broad as Romans, that is certainly more systematic than the other epistles, we still can't look at Romans and say that everything dealing with salvation is in Romans. Paul is still writing to a specific group and a specific occasion, and the other epistles deal with other aspects of salvation that simply are not dealt with in Romans. Number 3, therefore, we cannot get a complete teaching on any subject from just one passage or even from one epistle. So be careful not to make a rigid doctrine from a single passage. In 1 Corinthians 15, to their detriment, the Mormons have determined that we should be baptized for the dead because they took one verse that Paul mentioned, that people are baptized for the dead, in a broader argument about belief in the resurrection, saying that even these people who are not necessarily Christians at all still believe in the resurrection and are baptized for the dead, wanting them to be able to play a part in the resurrection of the dead. Even they believe in the resurrection. The broader argument is that there is a resurrection, not that we should be baptized for the dead. Well, now that we understand some of these very important points about the nature of the epistles, let's take a look at the historical and cultural context of the epistles. There are some very important questions we need to ask ourselves when we look at any given epistle. The first question is, when was the epistle written? Now let's take Hebrews for example, and you probably wouldn't be able to get the answer from this just by reading the epistle. You'll need to do some extra homework, and a good Bible dictionary would be very helpful for this. I looked at a Bible dictionary, and I found this answer for when Hebrews was written. According to Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, the Christians that the author is writing to had suffered a loss of property. Now, according to my Bible dictionary, these circumstances best fit an edict of Claudius in AD 49, which banned Christians from Rome. So they would have suffered a loss of property. But then the author of Hebrews continues to discuss that greater tests are ahead. And he's probably referring to the persecutions that are coming through Nero in AD 64. So it's most likely that the author of Hebrews wrote after AD 64, probably sometime close to then. So this helps us to understand when it was written, who it was written to. It's being written to persecuted Christians. And what is the political situation? The situation is really that these Christians are beginning to face persecutions. They haven't even suffered to the point of needing to shed their blood, as is explained in Hebrews chapter 12, which means they haven't died as martyrs. And so the author's warning them that tougher times are ahead. Now it seems clear from the way that Hebrews is written that many of these Christians were considering returning to Judaism or choosing a different type of religion that looked more like Judaism in order to avoid persecution. The author then systematically goes through and discusses how Jesus is better. A truer revelation came through Jesus, as is recorded in Hebrews 1. Jesus is better than Moses. Jesus is better than angels. Jesus is better than Aaron, the Levites. Jesus is better than the old covenant, establishing a new covenant as our high priest in Melchizedek. Time after time, chapter after chapter, the author of Hebrews deals with the concept that Jesus is better, because he wants to show them that they should not neglect such a great salvation and return to something that is dead and dying. So clearly, this helps us to understand who it's been written to, when it was written, the political situation. Number 4, if it's written to a church in a city, what was the history and culture of the church? In this particular situation, we don't know in Hebrews, but in the other epistles we certainly do know. And then number 5, what first century customs need to be understood. Now, first century and before that, in the book of Hebrews, it's important to have a good Old Testament sacrificial understanding, because the author deals with the Old Testament system and how it's a shadow of the reality that's found in Christ. So, when you consider any historical or cultural issues according to the epistles, it'd be good to consult a Bible dictionary, which hopefully you have in your library or you can find from another resource. This will help you get your background information. One very important point about the epistles as we leave this slide is that if you can, try to read them in one sitting all the way through, from start to end. Because honestly, the epistles are letters. And just like any other letter, it's meant to be read in one sitting. Now that may sound like a daunting task, but it will really help your overall understanding of each epistle if you can read it through. Now, broad-based topics within the epistles can easily be found in a Bible dictionary, which will again help you understand the concept behind the epistle itself. So now that we've looked at the historical and cultural considerations, let's look at the literary context of epistles. When we consider the epistles as a literary genre, we want to think paragraphs. Number 1, don't isolate only a verse. For example, in 1 John chapter 2, starting at verse 15, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now, if I were to stop right there and not have a clear understanding of what John means by the world, I may be able to take that verse out of context and say, John tells me not to love the world. Okay, I can't appreciate a beautiful sunset. No love for that. Or a flower, any part of creation. I am told not to love the world. Well, that's a dangerous concept, because that's not what John means at all. If we continue in the paragraph, we have a better understanding by what he means from the world. He continues in verse 16 by saying, everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. So we see that in this context, John is not talking about the beautiful things that God has made in creation. Rather, he's talking about the lusts of the flesh and the sinful nature of man that has corrupted the world. John is essentially saying you need to flee from this. Without looking at the epistles as paragraphs, we miss the broader context of what he's saying. Now, to finish out that paragraph, he says, "The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever." So we need to look at the overall context of the book. Now, when we consider 1 John, John makes it easy for us. He says, "I write this to you so that you will not sin." So as we consider any given paragraph within the epistle of 1 John, we should think about this broad concept of he's writing so that we will not sin. How then does John's exhortation not to love the world fit in with that broader concept? This will help us better understand each portion of the epistle once we understand the overall theme. And then number 4, we say that knowing Greek or using a New Testament Greek lexicon is especially helpful in the study of the epistles. There are some very difficult texts where the English rendering or your native language's rendering, unless it's Greek, may be misleading to you in your understanding. So a lexicon can be helpful. There's a particularly thorny and difficult topic in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. It reads in the NIV, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent." Now, as we consider that, some strange doctrines have come up and many different interpretations have come up. But the important thing to understand here, if we look at a Greek lexicon, is that when Paul says that a woman's not permitted to have authority over a man, he uses a Greek word that is not used anywhere else in the entire New Testament. The Greek word that he uses for authority, according to my Greek lexicon, says that it is one who with their own hand kills another. One who acts on their own authority. Someone who is autocratic. An absolute master. One who exercises dominion over another. So clearly Paul is not saying that women can't have a position of authority in the church. He is rather saying that women cannot usurp the power of the church structure. They cannot set themselves up in their own authority, but must be appointed. Certainly Paul writes to many women in his epistle greetings throughout his books, and we see that they are in positions of authority. There are certainly those who are church leaders, and the church meets in their house. They are women. So Paul's writing here about authority is very specific, and it's the only time this Greek word is used. Now, we wouldn't know that and might be deceived in thinking women can't have any authority unless we were to look into the original language Greek to help us better understand these difficult passages in the epistles. Well, that concludes our first session of Class 8. In our next class, we'll deal in detail with the hermeneutics of the epistles. I'll see you then.